All right, part 3 of Centrarchidae. Let's talk about the black basses, which are the genus Micropterus. Of course, these are crazy popular sport fish. We've got the largemouth bass, the spotted bass, which we also call the Kentucky bass. I tend to call them Kentucky bass more than anything. And the smallmouth bass are the three that we're going to worry about here. They are top predators, they're voracious eaters, they're super aggressive, very popular sport fish. So the largemouth bass, the bucket mouths, have a large mouth, right? And the way we look at the mouth is we close it and we look at the upper jaw. And the upper jaw goes past the rear of the eye in the largemouth bass. The smallmouth and the Kentucky bass, it only goes to about the midpoint of the eye. Now, we gotta make it very clear, this is in adult fish, larger fish. Anything smaller than, well, I don't want to give you a size here, I don't know. But in smaller fish, this is not reliable because their mouth is not as big. So we have to have some other characteristics. This is in, age 1 and older fish for the most part. And so again, we're looking at the rear margin of the upper part of the mouth. So that kind of like flap, for lack of a better word. You see how that goes well past the eye in the largemouth, but it only meets the eye in the smallmouth and the Kentucky bass. And again, I make the point, this does not work on young fish. So here I'm showing you how you got to close the mouth, and you can see how that big part of the jaw does not go past the eye. Now, the Kentucky bass, same thing. That previous picture was a smallmouth bass, but in the Kentucky bass you also have the smaller mouth. But the Kentucky bass is also called the spotted bass for a reason. If you look below the lateral line, you often have rows of spots, and this is more obvious again in the adult fish. But you can see those rows of spots, so it looks a little bit like a spotted sucker. Remember those? So that's something else that'll help you identify the older bass. Largemouth have a very dark stripe down their lateral line. In the Kentucky bass, this stripe is dark, but it's what I call blotchy. It's like a series of diamonds. It's not nearly as well defined as it is in the largemouth. The smallmouth does not have that horizontal line. It has vertical bars, all right? So again, coloration will help you. Here you can see that blotchy lateral line. It's not well defined. It's like a bunch of diamonds or a bunch of bigger spots that are joined together. That's your Kentucky bass or your spotted bass. Here you look at the largemouth, which is on the right, and you can see how that line is not blotchy, it's more well defined. But then you look at the smallmouth, and you can see it doesn't even have that line. It's got vertical bars. The smallmouth also has a much more brownish or bronze coloration, so they're often called bronze backs. The smallmouth also has those wavy lines in the face that are not nearly as obvious in the Kentucky or the largemouth. It looks almost like a warmouth a little bit, so that coloration will also tip it off. Other things you can look at in the largemouth, the two dorsal fins, the spinous and the soft dorsal fins, are nearly separate. Remember, in the Centrarchidae, they're all connected, but they're almost separate in the largemouth, whereas in the Kentucky bass, they're very well connected. Another way to describe that is that the shortest spine in the dorsal fin of the largemouth bass is less than half of the biggest spine. So there's a large variety in this length of the spines. Whereas in the Kentucky bass, that shortest spine is more than half the largest spine. So the spines are much more even in size. So here you're looking at a largemouth bass, and you can see there's just two ways of describing the same thing. You can say, look, that notch is very deep in the dorsal fin. The two fins are almost separate. But if you look at that shortest spine, it's less than half of the biggest spine. There's a lot of variety in the spine length. Whereas in this Kentucky bass, you don't have as much variety, and consequently, that notch is not as deep between the two dorsal fins. So that'll help you. And then finally, you can talk about the tooth patch. Largemouth do not have a tooth patch normally. The Kentucky bass does have the tooth patch. And you know, their mouth is big, so usually this can be felt. Except in Kentucky Lake, almost a third of the largemouth have that tooth patch to some degree on the tongue. So that's not as good. You've got those other characteristics. Do they hybridize? They probably do. Probably not very common, but that probably helps to explain some of this overlap in characteristics. Now, that's all for the adult fish. What if you get a young fish, a young of the year, or a smaller fish? It's much, much more difficult. The only thing well, I will say that often the smallmouth has a little bit more of that brown coloration and is a little bit more obvious. But the thing that most people use is the tri-colored tail. Your smallmouth and your Kentucky bass have the tri-colored tail. Your largemouth has the two-colored tail. That's in general what people use. And so if it's got a tri-colored tail, then you can often tell by the general coloration whether it's a smallmouth or a Kentucky bass. Now this tricolored tail is sometimes the trick. Is that a tricolored tail? It's kind of hard to tell. Usually it's pretty obvious, right? If you have to ask yourself, is this a tricolored tail? It's probably not a tricolored tail. It's the colors are well defined. It's brown, black, white. Having said that, I've looked at a ton of small bass in Kentucky Lake, and a lot of them have the tricolored tail, but they don't look like Kentucky bass. So in Kentucky Lake, I'm a little soft on this one. I don't know, but I need to look at more, need to study this more. But in general, this is the characteristic that people use to distinguish them. And so here you're kind of seeing the tricolored tail, the brown, the black, the white is on the end, and it doesn't show up well in this picture. But you see a very, pretty well defined border between the black and the brown. Here's a good picture of it where you can really see that brown, that black, and the white is on the end. But you can look at the lateral line on this one, and it very much looks like a Kentucky bass lateral line. So this is what a lot of people use for these younger fish. It's maybe not perfect, but that's the best you got. And so really that's it for identifying the black basses. That's all we're going to talk about with Centrarchidae. We could talk about a lot more, but we've got to cut off somewhere. Those are the most common fish you're going to find. That's all I've got. Thanks for listening. I'll see you later.